Hi everyone, in today's video I'm going to talk about the latest character that's been added to the game, which is Sphinx Pharaoh. Now, as usual, I'll be going through his clothes, his skills, his constellation, etc. And I'll also post some pictures of how to clear all of his 12 stages. Alright, now let's start off with his ultimate, which is a quite interesting one. It's interesting for one reason, it doesn't actually do much damage. That may be actually quite surprising to you because he is actually an assassin knight, which theoretically means he should be a DPS, he should be doing damage. But that's not the case for Pharaoh at all. And that's because his ultimate what does is that it targets the enemy, which have dealt the highest amount of damage, which is nice. And it borrows 50% of that target's current HP. Now, no, this is current HP rather than maximum HP. And that basically means is that no matter what you do, you won't be able to kill that person off by borrowing HP from them. So it's just as simple as that. And also, that HP will actually be returned after a few seconds as well. And the borrow HP can't be more than a certain percentage of that. Now, because you are borrowing that HP and then you're returning back, and you can't actually kill that enemy off from borrowing itself, this actually is going to do a net damage of 0, which is quite surprising. And the main reason this is actually if you actually look at the way Sphinx Pharaoh is actually positioned, I don't think he is actually a traditional assassin knight. He's more like a supporting. Almost want to say it's an assist knight, but assisting to kill off the enemy. So that's kind of why he, I guess, assassin. Maybe that's why they classified it. But definitely don't think of him as a damage DPS. Now, during the entire period where you're borrowing that HP, what happens, the healing effect of that target is going to reduce by 75%. And at the same time, he actually have a halo effect, which is basically saying as soon as he's on the field, all of the enemy will have a reduced healing effect by 25%. So that together, I'm pretty sure they stack. And that basically means the enemy wouldn't be able to heal anything at all during that entire period, which is actually quite strong. And this is exactly the position I think Pharaoh is really playing, is that he's targeting the enemy so that you first of all borrow a lot of HP from them, so they're already quite vulnerable. And because they are not able to heal themselves up either during that duration, it makes it easier for your other teammates to kill the enemy off. So if you do actually play Pharaoh, you definitely want to pair him up with other DPS. That is for certain. Otherwise, his ultimate is not going to get any use at all. There is also a really nice secondary effect for Pharaoh, which is that his own HP percentage would not be lower than the target. And that basically just means you wouldn't die for that entire period unless the enemy dies. So I guess in some sense, it's almost as a way, as a defensive skill as well. Because from what I've seen in his trial stages, Pharaoh is actually quite fragile. So this is actually a good way to prevent Pharaoh from dying, assuming that the enemy target is not dead. If the enemy target is dead, then fine, you kill off one of the enemy, and if your Pharaoh dies as well, as it is a one-on-one trade. So it's not too bad either. But otherwise, at least you guarantee your Pharaoh will be able to survive for this entire time. Now, the only other comment I will make on this one is that because you're actually borrowing off the enemy's current HP, that's going to make their HP percentage really, really low. So a really good combination that I can think of is that if you pair Sphinx Pharaoh with someone like Pandora or Deal, who is actually able to hone in on the enemy with the lowest HP percentage. And this really help you to make sure that you're actually able to take advantage of this ultimate and actually kill off the enemy. So that would be a really good pairing that I can think of. All right. Now moving on to his second skill. This to me is actually his most interesting skill. And basically, what happens is that he plays Curse, a status effect, on the enemy opposite him for 4 seconds. And during that time, you ignore all of the passive skills on the enemy, which is actually really, really strong. Now, passive skill varies a lot between night to night, so it's kind of situational to some extent because it depends on who exactly are you going to face. But I can tell you this is actually a really, really important skill, especially in future when Iki got close will be eventually released. He is like one of the best characters in the game, and he partially is due to his really strong passive, which basically prevents him from being killed. Essentially, quite simply, like if there's any other ally on the field, then he wouldn't die. That kind of thing. So this is actually a really, really strong ability, and because of that, you really want a way to really neutralize that. And one of the easiest way to neutralize that is if you can actually make that passive skill not working at all. And Pharaoh is one of the few characters who are able to do that. And I can also tell you that out of all the characters who are able to make the passive skill not working, I believe apart from Pharaoh, everyone else is light and dark, and that basically makes Sphinx Pharaoh in a really, really niche position as a budget version of having this ability to make passive skills uh, no working essentially. So that is actually a really good selling point, and just for this point alone, I mean I will talk more towards the end of the video, but I actually think Pharaoh is someone that's worth for you to something on because this is just a very very useful skill, especially later on when you actually move to something like 3 on 3 or 5 versus 5 team battle. Sometimes you actually want at least one character on each one of your team who has the ability to break the enemy's passive skill. Sorry, and in that case, Pharaoh is gonna be a really, really good choice for you to fill in those multiple teams. And even if you don't need to fill in multiple tours, if you just need to fill in one team, to do that, at least you have a budget option of being able to break the enemy's passive skill without relying on one of the future light and dark characters. So that's is a really important selling point to me for Sphinx Pharaoh. Now, more on this skill, obviously, I just talk about kind of the most important aspect. But then the other aspect is that if the target's HP is currently lower than 75%, at end of the curse, then you will do some additional damage. Now, you can almost think of this as a combo with his ultimate, because assuming you apply the curse first, then you use the ultimate, which then reduce their current HP by another 50%. There's a high chance it will be lower than 75% at the end of the curse, and therefore you will do some damage. And because the ultimate is activated after your looping skill, after your curse, so hopefully it's still doing the span of the ultimate, and therefore you'll actually be able to kill off the enemy. So this could be another way of how you want to use it. The only thing with this method of actually kind of doing a combo between these two skills is that his ultimate focus on the enemy that have dealt the highest damage, whereas this one you ideally want to place it opposite character which have a really strong passive skill, and that may or may not be the enemy's DPS. So there's also a good chance that you wouldn't actually have those two skills, even though they seem to have a natural combo between them. There's a high chance you won't actually be able to pull it off because they won't actually be targeting the same enemy. So that's kind of the situational aspect of this one. But yeah, if I have to summarize this, if you do want to use this skill, use it more for the fact that it's able to break the enemy's passive skills. All right, now move on to his skill 3. This one's quite straightforward. Basically, it deals some damage to 3 enemies in front and also silence them for 2.5 seconds. Silence is a pretty strong control effect. It's not an interruption effect. So let's say if the enemy is already started animation of a skill, you won't be able to interrupt them. However, you are able to silence them, so they are not able to use any other skills during that time. So it has pros and cons compared to an interruption skill, but I certainly think it's a quite useful one to have. And it's a looping skill and 3 enemies as well. So it's a quite wide range. Lastly, the halo effect, I already talked about that earlier. Just reduce all of the enemies healing by 25%. In all honesty, 25% by itself is not very high. If you obviously use it in conjunction with the ultimate, that becomes 100%, then that's really strong. But by itself, this halo effect is quite useless in my opinion. Alright, now moving on to his clothes. The first one, dispel off the buff. When you place that curse effect, which is actually really nice. Then the curse duration is extended to 6 seconds and cannot be dispelled. This is also very nice. So basically, for a longer time where the enemy is not able to use their passive, and it can't even be dispelled as well. So that's actually really, really important. Next one, curse of balance. HP borrowed will be returned after 6 seconds. I think from damage point of view, because this do a net damage of 0, so it doesn't really matter whether 4 seconds or 6 seconds in all honesty. However, I did mention the secondary effect is that because Pharaoh's HP percentage will not be lower than the target, so now you actually kind of think of it as more like Pharaoh will be unkillable for 6 seconds rather than 4 seconds, in which case I actually think it's quite nice. So I think this is actually a good one for you to scale up to. Then the last one, if the target dies during the period where the HP is lent by his ultimate, then Pharaoh will restore 30% max HP at 6,000 customer. 6,000 customer is a lot. That almost allow you to use the ultimate straight away again. And you almost kind of do a similar thing to Sagittarius Auroras, where as soon as you kill off an enemy, then you're able to release the ultimate again and try to go into this kind of snowball effect of just killing enemies one by one. The only problem is um, because the Sphinx Pharaoh doesn't actually do that much damage. Like I keep on repeating, his ultimate does a net damage of 0, so he is not actually able to make sure he's actually able to kill off the enemy at that time. You really need the help of your other teammates, and that's why I think this is probably a bit way too situational. So it's a bit up to you on whether you want to level it all the way up to level 30. I think if it is actually used, it's a very strong skill. I am just debating how often would it actually be activated in real life. So if it's up to me, I would say close in terms of close, you want to level up to at least level 20, so your Pharaoh can actually survive a bit longer. Level 30 is kind of up to you. It's more of a nice to have. Now for his constellation, it's pretty average. It's all to do with his halo effect, the one that's reducing the healing effect of the enemies. So at 3 out of 9, it will reduce the healing effect from 25% to 35%. There's not a massive increase, to be honest. And 9 out of 9 is actually a bit more meaningful because now it'll be doubled to 70%. However, that's only going to be triggered when Pharaoh actually do some damage, and it's only going to last for 3.5 seconds as well. And if you take a look at all of his skill 1 and 2, they are single target. Skill 3 is the only one that can actually hit multiple enemies, and that's the 3 enemies in front. So, really, for your constellation, you will only be able to activate that whenever his looping skill is taking effect. So, personally, I don't think it's very best value in terms of the resource it would take. Like normally you would expect 9 out of 9 constellation to be a massive power jump, but that's definitely not the case for Sphinx Pharaoh. So that's kind of why I personally think that you can probably skip his constellation altogether. Now, in terms of the final verdict about Sphinx Pharaoh, oh, sorry, there's the Wheel of Fate as well. Let me briefly go through that. So, Wheel of Fate for Ophi, gain attack bonus by 15% for each release of ultimate skill can be stacked by 3 times. What's interesting is that there's no cooldown, so theoretically you can be at 45% for vast majority of the battle. The only problem is that Ophi and Sphinx Pharaoh both doesn't really do too much damage. Like Ophi is just a support unit. Sphinx Pharaoh's ultimate doesn't even do any damage, like net damage. So even though this is a really good skill on paper, you're not really taking the most advantage of that attacking buff. So that's kind of why I think is pretty average. The other one, however, is quite interesting. This one is basically decreasing the tenacity and toughness by 6% for every crit, and it can be stacked up to 10 times. And once again, there's no cooldown. So in theory, you can have 60% reduction in tenacity and toughness for the entire battle, assuming you can crit uh, do 10 crits very quickly. And with Sagittarius, Seiya got close, who do have a high crit rate and also attack very fast, especially when he's opening duel. I actually think this is quite likely for you to be able to stack up. So, and also because Seiya got close can hit everyone with his skill 3. So theoretically, you can actually reduce everyone's tenacity and toughness by 60%. So this is actually a really strong attack. Um, and in all honesty, because Seiya Gokos and Shun Gokos are very, very strong knights, that you will almost, like, if you level them up, you would play them in your first team anyway. So even if you are not actually thinking of playing Sphinx Pharaoh in the same team as them to actually activate the power of Fate effect, purely from the passive bonus stats for, say, a Gokos and Shun Gokos, I think is already a very strong one for you to level up. So this one, I definitely do recommend you to level up if you do decide to get Sphinx Pharaoh. Now, in terms of the final verdict, I would recommend you to get this character as well. So definitely use your golden shell to pull on him. The reason is, well, 2 reasons. One, He's a fairly cheap character in the sense that, first of all, Golden Shield characters aren't quite easy to get generally, and also he doesn't really need much resource investment in terms of clothes. I think level 20 is enough. Level 30 is a cherry on top, but it's not compulsory. And similarly, Constellation you can skip altogether. So overall, he is fairly cheap for you to build and almost playable straight away. And then the other reason, like I mentioned before, his curse ability in order to break the enemy's passive is actually very, very unique. And out of all of the characters who are able to do that, once again, he's the cheapest character for able to do it without actually relying on light and dark. So, for example, if you do want to optimize your different resources, you now no longer need to actually spend all of your petals to get a light and dark character who is able to break the enemy's passive, because now you actually have Sphinx Pharaoh who's able to do the same thing. So that's why I really do think there's a value for him. Now, he is certainly, I'll be honest, he's not strong enough to be in your first team, probably not even in your team two most of the time, because he is very situational depending on who is the enemy you are going to face, whether you need to break that person's passive. So he may not be a character that you regularly play on your team. However, he would be one of the characters that you will regret not having if you do really want to break the enemy's passive and you just don't have a light and dark character in order to do so. So that's kind of why I say, just for that formal reason, you don't want to miss out on such a good opportunity, to break quite quite cheaply break the enemy's passive skill. So in general, overall, I do recommend you try to get Sphinx Pharaoh if you can.